Soft ballroom music plays. A glittering chandelier sways above a grand dance floor where wealthy guests whisper and laugh. In the corner, a maid carrying a tray pauses when the arrogant millionaire announces a cruel challenge. If she dares to dance this waltz, she must marry my son. The crowd bursts into laughter, mocking the maid as if she were beneath them. But what no one knows is that this woman carries a secret past, one that will silence every sneer in the room before the night is over. Under the golden glow of chandeliers, the ballroom shimmered with luxury. Laughter and polished shoes echoed across marble floors as glasses of champagne sparkled in guests' hands. The air was thick with perfume, ego, and the unspoken rule that only wealth determined worth. Among the swirling gowns and tailored suits moved the maid, silent and unseen, balancing a tray with steady hands. Her uniform was plain, her steps careful, her presence treated as background noise by those who barely noticed her. But that fragile invisibility shattered the moment the wealthy host, a man who fed on arrogance, decided to use her as entertainment. He stood tall in the center of the room, his voice cutting across music and conversation. With a smirk that curled like smoke, he announced for all to hear that if the maid dared to dance the waltz, she must marry his son. It was not an invitation. It was a dagger dipped in humiliation. For a moment, silence swept the room. Then came the laughter, cruel, sharp, merciless. Fans snapped shut, hands covered smirking mouths, and whispers hissed like snakes. Guests leaned into one another, mocking the very idea. A maid stepping onto their polished floor. The suggestion was obscene. She should know her place, someone muttered. Imagine the son holding her hand. Another laughed, the words coated in scorn. The sound of it stung more than words, filling the air with ridicule so thick it pressed against the maid's chest. She froze where she stood, tray clutched in her hands, the silver trembling ever so slightly. Heat flushed her cheeks, a flame of shame rising. She had not asked to be noticed. She had not wished to be dragged into their game. Yet here she was, pinned beneath dozens of eyes, their laughter crawling over her skin. The host's smirk widened. Feeding on her discomfort, his gaze daring her to refuse. At his side, the young heir shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tight, his lips parting as if to protest, but his father's presence pressed him silent. The orchestra faltered, strings humming uncertainly, waiting. The host raised a hand toward the dance floor, waving mockingly as if offering her a stage. A ripple of clapping broke out, not of admiration, but of cruelty. Guests began to exaggerate bows in her direction, calling out taunts disguised as encouragement. "Don't be shy," one voice chimed. "Show us what you've got," another laughed. Their jeers grew louder, swelling like a storm. It was no longer about a dance. It was about reminding her of the invisible cage they believed she belonged in. Her head shook slowly, her lips forming a silent refusal. She wanted to vanish, to disappear back into the safety of the kitchen where no one mocked her existence. But the pressure did not ease. Every mocking clap, every smirk, every cruel glance pressed her deeper into a corner. And then, amid the sea of sneers, she saw it, a single pair of eyes watching her differently. A quiet guest, seated slightly apart, offered no laugh, no smirk, no taunt. Their gaze held only calmness, a silent urging as if to say, "Do not let them decide your worth." Her breath caught. Something shifted inside her chest, a memory of strength buried under years of silence. She felt the humiliation melt into something steadier. She straightened her spine, her shoulders settling into quiet resolve. With a slow exhale, she lowered the tray, her fingers releasing the polished silver as it clicked softly onto the table. The sound cut through the laughter for just an instant, small but powerful. She stepped forward, one foot, then the other, her steps no longer timid. Every eye in the room followed, laughter swelling again in anticipation. To them, this was comedy. To her, it was something else entirely. The polished floor gleamed beneath her shoes as she crossed into the open space, where all could see her clearly. A cruel chuckle rose from the corner. "This will be fun." The words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. But she did not flinch. She stood in the center of the ballroom, her chin lifted, her face calm. For the first time, the laughter no longer felt like chains. It sounded distant, hollow, meaningless. The chandelier above swayed gently, scattering shards of light across her uniform. And though no one in that glittering hall knew it, the maid carried a secret, a hidden rhythm in her veins, a history that would turn their jeers into silence. Before the night was over, the first notes of the waltz spilled into the air, soft yet commanding, as if the orchestra itself sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. Strings lifted, horns whispered, and the rhythm filled the ballroom like a current pulling every heart into its tide. All eyes locked on the maid as she moved to the center. With a steady breath, she lowered herself into a curtsy, her movements smooth, graceful, untouched by nerves. Gasps slipped through the laughter, for her bow was not clumsy, not the awkward bend they expected, but measured and elegant, as though she had been born beneath chandeliers rather than behind them. Still, the crowd chuckled, convincing themselves. It was an act, a fleeting imitation of grace that would crumble with the first true step. The millionaire leaned back, smug satisfaction curling on his lips. He was waiting for the stumble, the fall, the humiliation that would seal her place beneath them. At his side, his son hesitated, shoulders tight, reluctant to even touch the hand offered to him. But when his palm finally met hers, he froze. The grip was not weak, not timid, but steady and assured, a silent message carried through fingertips. "Do not underestimate me." His brow furrowed, confusion flickering where disdain had rested. Then came the first step. The maid did not falter. She moved as though the floor belonged to her, as though the music were an old friend guiding her across the polished marble. Her feet glided effortlessly, turning with precision, sweeping into the rhythm with such natural ease that the orchestra seemed to lean into her rather than lead her. The guests blinked, startled. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind across water. Some laughed nervously, clinging to the hope that she would misstep any second now. They leaned forward, waiting for failure. But failure never came. Each turn sharpened the truth. Her back remained tall, her shoulders poised, her movements exact. The son, expecting to guide, found himself being guided instead, his body pulled into rhythm by her confidence. His eyes widened, his composure cracking as he realized she wasn't surviving the waltz, she was commanding it. Whispers spread like wildfire, bouncing from lip to lip. "She dances like a professional." The sentence carried disbelief, then awe, then silence as realization dawned on the room. The millionaire's smugness faltered. His fingers tapped nervously against his glass, his throat tightening as he watched the performance twist away from mockery and into revelation. This was not what he had orchestrated. He had planned for her shame, not her triumph. Around her, the ballroom transformed. Her plain uniform, a symbol of servitude, shifted before their eyes. With each twirl, each spin, the fabric caught the chandelier's glittering light, cascading across her form until she seemed to wear elegance itself. The skirt flared with movement, not silken but no less stunning, made regal by the sheer authority of her presence. She was no longer the maid. She was the centerpiece. For a brief heartbeat, she closed her eyes. In that darkness, memories surged forward, her younger self in a worn studio, feet bruised but strong, music echoing as she trained for competitions. The cheers of small crowds, the joy of medals clutched in proud hands, the burning passion of being seen not as a servant, but as an artist. Then came the shadow of tragedy, the loss that pushed her from stages to kitchens, from spotlight to silence. The weight of that past pressed into her chest, but in this moment it lifted, burning away beneath the music. She was not forgotten. She was still a dancer. When her eyes opened, the ballroom shimmered differently. The guests were no longer laughing. Their silence grew heavy, reverent, broken only by the sound of the orchestra, which seemed to play with new fervor, as if even the musicians had been swept into her orbit. Each note struck harder, brighter, matching her every move. The air, once reluctant, now surrendered fully to the rhythm. His earlier resistance melted into awe, his lips curving into the faintest smile. He no longer saw her as a burden forced upon him, but as a revelation pulling him into a world he had never imagined. With each spin, his respect deepened, his posture following hers, his disbelief replaced by admiration. He had not expected to be led, but he allowed himself to be. Around the hall, jeweled necklaces no longer gleamed brighter than her presence. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to look away. They had expected comedy, but found themselves witness to art. They had come for humiliation, but were given brilliance. Even the smug host could not mask the growing discomfort etching across his face. As the final notes of the waltz cascaded through the air, the maid's movement slowed into a final turn, her steps drawing the sun with her into perfect alignment. The music ceased with a flourish, leaving silence so sharp it pressed against the walls. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The maid stood still, chin lifted, chest rising and falling softly. The ballroom, once thick with laughter, was frozen in stunned disbelief. What began as a cruel jest had transformed into something none could deny, a breathtaking performance that defied every sneer, every whisper, every assumption they had clung to. The chandelier above swayed gently, scattering light across her figure as though the very room itself bowed to her triumph. And in the heavy stillness that followed, the truth hung clear. She was not simply the maid. She was the dance. The last note of the orchestra lingered in the air, trembling against the walls like a final breath. For a moment, silence swallowed the ballroom whole. The guests sat frozen, eyes wide, lips parted, unable to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a pair of hands came together in a slow, deliberate clap. The sound echoed sharply in the silence, startling those around it. Another clap followed, then another, until the hesitant rhythm grew louder, joined by more hands, more voices, more astonishment. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause, thundering against the chandeliers, shaking the polished floor. Cheers rose above the clapping, and the faces that had been twisted in mockery only moments before now glowed with awe. The millionaire, who only minutes ago had stood proud and smug, felt the world tilt beneath his feet. His smile had vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of disbelief. His jaw clenched, his fists tightened around the stem of his glass until it threatened to shatter. This had not been the spectacle he had planned. He wanted ridicule, not reverence. He wanted his wealth, to shine above all, not be overshadowed by the brilliance of a maid's hidden talent. Anger twisted his features, but his fury only made him smaller in the eyes of those around him. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering without restraint. Their voices no longer carried mockery but admiration, their words heavy with awe. "Did you see her steps? Perfect. She moved like royalty. She's extraordinary." The room that had once laughed at her now drank in her presence with reverence. The tide had turned, and admiration flowed not toward the host, not toward his son, but toward the very woman he had tried to humiliate. The maid, still breathing steadily from the dance, bowed gracefully, her movement simple yet dignified. She did not revel in the applause, nor did she bask in the sudden change of hearts. She only sought to retreat quietly, to slip back into the shadows where she had always been expected to remain. But before she could step away from the glow of the chandeliers, a sharp voice cut through the applause. The host's voice, trembling, with fury ordered her to stop. The clapping faded into uneasy murmurs as all eyes shifted back to him. His words came out rough, strained with desperation. He accused her of deceit, of trickery, as though the skill they had all witnessed was nothing but an elaborate illusion. His demand rang out harshly. Where had she learned to dance like that? The maid did not shrink from his anger. She did not raise her voice or meet cruelty with cruelty. Instead, she stood tall, her face calm, her tone measured. She spoke not of magic or secrets, but of truth. She explained with a quiet dignity that commanded the room that she had once been a dancer, a competitor who had claimed victories, who had once lived for the stage and the music. Life, however, had turned its course, tragedy and hardship, pressing her from the spotlight into labor, from gowns into uniforms, from applause into invisibility. Gasps rippled across the ballroom, fans fluttered against lips, eyes widened in realization. Suddenly, her elegance, her poise, her mastery of the floor made perfect sense. This was not luck. This was not chance. This was the echo of a champion rediscovered, the weight of her. Revelation silenced even the whispers. The heir stood beside her, no longer stiff with reluctance, no longer looking upon her with the distant eyes of privilege. He stared with something closer to awe, his expression softened by the truth. She was no servant in this moment. She was someone who had lived more, fought more, and carried herself with a strength far beyond the shallow world he had always known. But the millionaire could not surrender the stage. His pride, sharp and brittle, lashed out like a whip. With a sneer, he spat his final weapon. No matter how well you dance, you will never be one of us. His voice rang across the hall, filled with venom, filled with the confidence that the crowd would once again follow his lead. Yet the laughter he expected never came. Not a single smirk answered him. Instead, the hall shifted with cold disapproval. The same guests who had laughed at the maid earlier now turned their glares upon him. His words hung heavy in the air, not triumphant but hollow, exposed as the cruelty they truly were. His authority cracked, splintered, and fell apart under the weight of their silence. Then, from the crowd, another voice rose, this one warm, commanding, and filled with respect. An influential guest, known and admired, stepped forward. They praised the maid openly, their words strong enough to fill the cracks the host had left behind. They spoke of her skill, her grace, her brilliance, calling her not a servant but an artist. Their voice carried further still, offering her opportunities beyond the walls of this room, an invitation back into the world of dance, back into the place she had been forced to abandon. The murmurs grew louder, admiration swelling again, but this time it carried weight, promises, possibilities. The maid stood still, her head bowed slightly, not overwhelmed but steady, absorbing the respect that now flowed toward her. The host, meanwhile, shrank beneath the very spotlight he had tried to control. For the first time, his wealth and power could not silence the truth before him. The balance had shifted. The laughter he had commanded had turned into applause for another, and the grip he once held over the room had been broken. The ballroom no longer felt the same. Where once she had stood in silence, carrying trays like a shadow, now she was surrounded by light and voices that sought her, not to belittle, but to admire. Guests who had sneered at her moments ago now approached with softened expressions, their words tumbling out in apologies and admiration. They asked how she moved with such precision, begged to know where she had trained, even went so far as to request that she one day teach them the very steps they had mocked her for daring to attempt. It was not pity in their eyes. It was genuine awe, the kind reserved for those who had revealed something greater than themselves. For the first time in this grand hall, she was not invisible. She was the reason the room was alive. At her side, the heir stood quieter than the rest. His face, once filled with hesitation and embarrassment, carried a new humility. When he spoke, his words did not rise above the noise but reached her with sincerity. He thanked her in a voice almost trembling, confessing that she had opened his eyes. He admitted he had been blinded by the narrow vision his father had painted, taught to measure worth in money and status, never realizing how false that measure truly was. In her, he saw something his world lacked: strength rooted in dignity, grace born not of wealth but of resilience. His gratitude was small, yet to her it felt heavier than the applause, for it carried truth. But across the room, the host burned with fury. His face reddened, his lips pulled back in a grimace as he tried to shout above the crowd, demanding control, demanding that attention return to him. Yet his voice was no longer a command. It was a weak protest drowned beneath thunderous applause. No matter how much power or wealth he wielded, he could not buy back the respect that had shifted so completely toward the maid. His words, once law, now sounded empty, brittle, stripped of weight. For the first time, he was powerless in his own ballroom. The maid, however, did not revel in his downfall. She did not gloat or throw his humiliation back at him. Her triumph was not his defeat, but her own liberation. She did not seek revenge, for true strength required no cruelty in return. Instead, she held her head high, her posture calm, her face serene. She allowed the applause to wash over her, not as validation she craved, but as proof that the truth could not be hidden forever. She turned from the crowd and began to walk away, not retreating but leaving with the quiet dignity of someone who knew her worth. The noise of the room continued behind her, yet with every step the distance grew, and the echoes of admiration became less about spectacle and more about reflection. Those who had mocked were left to sit with the sting of their own shame. Near the edge of the hall, away from the glitter and noise, she paused. The quiet guest who had watched her earlier with silent support stepped forward. Their expression was calm, their voice low but filled with warmth. They told her she had not simply danced a waltz that evening. She had reminded every person in that hall what true grace meant. Grace was not about gowns or titles, nor chandeliers or applause. It was about standing tall in the face of cruelty, moving with dignity when surrounded by mockery, and transforming humiliation into strength. In her steps, they had all seen something more powerful than wealth. They had seen the spirit of a champion. The maid listened, her lips curving into the faintest smile. She felt no need to answer, for the truth had already been spoken aloud. For so long, she had been defined by her uniform, dismissed as though it erased the life she had once lived. But now, with her secret revealed and her past reclaimed, she no longer carried herself as a servant. Her every step bore the weight and elegance of the dancer she had always been. The ballroom had forced her onto the stage, but she had left it owning the floor entirely. As she reached the doors, the applause still thundered behind her, echoing through the high ceilings, clinging to the walls like the memory of something unforgettable. The chandeliers above swayed gently, casting shards of golden light across the polished floor, as though bowing to the one who had truly ruled the night. The music had ended. The dance was complete, yet the echoes of her triumph lingered long after. A single waltz, meant to humiliate, had instead transformed everything. It silenced ridicule, dismantled arrogance, and replaced it with awe. She walked away not as a maid defined by her labor, but as a champion, proud and free, leaving behind a hall forever changed by the grace of her steps.